This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode, Geeta Mehta, author of Japanese Gardens, talks about the beauty, philosophy, and deep cultural roots of Japan's garden traditions. We delve into how these serene landscapes reflect harmony, mindfulness, and a unique dialogue between nature and design.
I'm an architect, and I lived in Japan for 23 years and completely fell in love with Japan. And that's when I wrote 5 books about Japanese design, including the book on Japanese gardens. And now I live in New York. I teach at Columbia University, where I was also a student many years ago. And so always been deeply involved in design and love the gardens, and especially the Japanese gardens.
So you've written a beautiful book about Japanese gardens and it is really lovely, and it's not just visually lovely, but it's very, very good at explaining the ideas behind Japanese garden design and behind the individual gardens. And what's interesting is that you've included a mixture of public and private spaces. And I wondered, is it quite unusual to see inside the private gardens? Because I felt quite privileged actually looking at some of those spaces in the book.
Yes, it's actually very unusual. And we had to get special permission to see some of these gardens that are documented in the book. And also, I want to say that some of these gardens and spaces are being lost, So it was really precious to document these things for this book as well as my book on Japan style, because some of those wonderful, wonderful artworks in terms of architecture and garden design are in danger actually of being lost. So yes, it was very special to get permission and be able to visit the private gardens, yes.
And you actually mentioned in the book about the kind of pressures on these spaces because they're often on prime property building locations, and also there's the expense involved in the upkeep of these spaces. Who kind of bears the brunt of this? I'm assuming it's the private property owners themselves.
Yes. Those are the only kind of people who are able to actually maintain their gardens, because it's a very, very large expense. And so these are families that have been very wealthy families for a very long time. And then a lot of them hold on to these precious gardens because they are from their ancestors and they have family memories. So this is more than just a garden. They want to hold on to it and maintain it as respect to their ancestors. And yes, a huge amount of expense and really not that much public support, not that much government support. So yes, it's private gardens are privately maintained. Yes.
Yeah, and I may be plucking this figure out the air, but I've got a feeling that you mentioned one of the homes is owned by somebody and they're the 12th generation that have lived in this house of the family. And that's just amazing. And kind of taking a long view, stepping back a bit, I wondered how long the gardening tradition dates back in Japan.
That's a really good question, because you have to go back to pre-Buddhist Japan, from the time of animistic religion, nature worship, and ancestor worship. So there used to be sacred spots, and these sacred spots may not even have a building called a shrine, but they may be just sacred because they are in front of a spectacular mountain, or it's a certain tree or something that makes nature so spectacular, and it's a marker for that. So then there would be like these white pebbles around that, and that's how the tradition of Japanese garden started. And once Buddhism arrived, of course, just like architecture, culture, language, science, everything changed. And so the Japanese gardens also changed, but in a very special way. The influences were absorbed, but not completely took over the Shinto ideas. And so the Japanese gardens do often have influences that are Chinese or Korean, but also they maintain their really, I want to say, unbroken line of aesthetics from pre-Buddhist Japan. So yes, the traditions go out very, very long time ago. Yes.
Yeah, and you mentioned the things like the gravel that I think most people, certainly in maybe the British gardening world, they think of those elements, those hard landscaping elements, as really key to Japanese garden design. But actually, aside from the symbolism that's associated with the hard landscaping elements, you mention in the book as well that some plants carry symbolism too. How common is the symbolism in the plants that arrive in these gardens?
So, for example, pine trees. Pine trees are a symbol of vitality, of longevity, of beauty. Whereas bamboo, as you know, the kind that is very popular in Japan, it shoots out of the ground with great force and can actually damage something sitting on that, even an elephant, they say. There are no elephants in Japan, but that's how strong it is when it comes out. And then it grows like one notch every day. And so many boys in Japan have their name named after bamboo, and because it stands for vitality. And then cherry blossoms and plum blossoms stand for beauty. So combining these three is very symbolic in Japanese gardens and in Japanese ikebana traditions, the flower arrangement traditions, to show vitality, longevity, and then beauty and ephemeral qualities of those blossoms. So yes, a lot of symbolism.
And the other thing that you speak about in the book is the sort of two main types of garden, and that is the gardens that you move through and the gardens that you view. I mean, is it safe to say that the gardens tend to fall into one of those two categories?
Yes, there could be gardens that have elements that are just to view. So those are viewing gardens. And then the other kind of garden is a stroll garden where you actually enter the garden and you follow a path. And that usually is designed so that at every corner you turn, you might see something very special or beautiful. Or there might be you're walking on a stone path, and some stone may be so uneven that you're obliged to look down. And then when you look up, there will be like a lantern or a certain tree that they want you to see with fresh eyes. Mitate, it's called in Japanese, mitate. So that's the act of seeing things with fresh eyes. So yes, so there are viewing gardens and there are stroll gardens, but then they may have elements of either. And then large gardens may also include a dry rock garden as well as a stroll garden. So yes, very large gardens may do that.
And also there's a garden that you talk about which has got I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but a doma, which is kind of like a inter-house and garden space. And that really fascinated me. How common are they?
Yes. So, you know, there's a saying in Japan that's like counterintuitive. The saying is that you can live anywhere in the winter, but the house should be designed for summer. It's counterintuitive because parts of Japan get a lot of snow, like in Japanese Alps. But the idea of designing a house where the breeze comes in and the house is breathing and it's made of wood. And that's why even when concrete became popular after the earthquake, people who could afford it still chose to have wooden homes because they are alive and they are living and they are breathing and so on. So I think that for that reason, the relationship of inside and outside is very important in Japanese design. So oftentimes when, especially in Heian period, for example, when aristocrats would design a home, first it would be the garden, and then the leftover space would be where the house is. And the windows and the sliding doors of the house will be designed to have the best view of the garden. So garden drove the design of the interior and the house. And then there's a large space all around the Japanese home, which is the transitional space. And so you can open the sliding doors and then the inside out is in very close relationship. So these transitional spaces are very interesting and important. Even in farmhouses, there would be a place called doma, and that would be like where you enter, you take your shoes off. Maybe there's some craft or storage that also happens there, but that's a transition space between the outside and the inside when you step up onto the tatami mat, and then you are in the inside. So yeah, lots of these beautiful, beautiful ideas and customs.
The other thing that I was looking at, aside from the kind of houses and that inter-house garden space, which kind of made me think, wow, I know it does get cold and it snows in lots of places in Japan. And I thought, well, that for, I suppose, me is quite alien to kind of open the house up like that when there's that potential for bad weather, and it's just not something that you see a lot here. But the other thing that I found definitely a departure from what I'm used to was the fact that a lot of the gardens actually make it purposely difficult for you to move through them, because they are trying to get your brain to behave in a certain way, or they're trying to make you stop and think. And we are always trying to make our gardens more easy to traverse, whereas in Japan some of these gardens are really like as well as an emotional journey and a visual journey, they're literally a physical journey.
Yes, the intent of entering a Japanese garden or entering a tea garden, for example, every special tea house has a tea garden attached to that. So there are opportunities for you to cleanse your mind and get in the correct mindset to really, in a very pure state of mind, to enter these spaces and then enjoy them. So it's not so much about a wow factor as opposed to the idea of letting you connect with your deeper self through this beautiful experience. So one example I can give is like the tea garden. So in the tea garden, there will be an entrance gate, very small, I mean, more symbolic than actual gate, maybe very low bamboo, something. And then you would enter, so the guest would enter, and the host will not be inside. The host knows you entered, but the host will not come out because the host wants you to have time to compose yourself. So then you would progress, and there would be a little place to sit, like a bench or a little structure. And then you would sit there as long as you need to till you feel that you are ready to come. And the owner of the tea house would have probably watered the stones, because stones look much more beautiful when they are watered and wet. And so then you would walk on this roji, or the stone path, towards the tea house. And that's when the tea master may come out and welcome you. So, there's a spiritual element to experiencing the Japanese garden. It's not just for fun, it's deeper than that.
And you mentioned the dimension of time within the gardens and the garden designs themselves, which I think is a bigger consideration for Japanese gardens and designers than it is for, say, us here. And can you talk about how much time is actually factored in and considered when somebody's laying out a garden or when a garden's been devised?
Yeah, hundreds of years. And in the book, I talk about the bonsai garden, and some of those bonsai are 1,500 years old. So those things have been in the family. And it is said that, if there's a fire, the family will often want to save their bonsai as their most precious belonging when they are getting things out of the fire, for example. So that element of time, how do you train a tree to be a spectacular bonsai? Or in the garden, it was such a lovely experience for me to go early morning in these gardens. So my co-author is Kimie Tada and the photographer Murata-san. So they all wanted to go there before the dew goes away, right? So sometimes we would see these gardeners with almost like tweezers, pulling one dried up needle from a pine tree. And the care that goes into it and the respect for very, very old trees, for example, it's an integral part of a Japanese garden design. And you may often see that some of the very, very old pine trees have been supported on several supports because to help them to stay vital for a long time. So time is, yes, an important element. And also it goes from generation to generation to generation. Yes, there have been famous garden designers, but their concept or their work is really respected and preserved over hundreds of years. So yeah, time is very important.
That leads me on to think about how gardens might evolve over time or not. But you mention, and I'm going to quote you here because you say that the gardens are a perfect balance of stillness and dynamism. So you've got that core element of the stillness and the factors of the design that don't change, and they might evolve, but they're still quite static. And then you've got this dynamic where you've got plants growing and changing shape and becoming mature. When I looked at the visuals in the book, I immediately got what you meant, and it was something that I hadn't picked up on before. Just that absolute juxtaposition of the static and the moving. That's a really, really interesting element of the designs.
And also appreciation of the seasons, seasonality. So a Japanese garden never has plants that'll bloom all at once in different colors. It's very much controlled in the sense that like one plant, one kind of tree might bloom at this time and then something else may bloom at another time. So there is that dynamism, but at the same time it's controlled. And also you may have read that in Japanese gardens, there's an idea of shake, which means borrowed scenery. So you're borrowing from the mountain or a whole bunch of trees or a forest that might be beyond the garden, doesn't belong to you, but visually you design to take that into account. So that means that you're also taking the seasonality of the surroundings of the garden, which will be visible to you. For example, autumn leaves, or cherry blossoms. And the other really interesting thing is that you edit out what you don't want to see. So there might be a wall just high enough to edit out what you don't want to see, but then in another location, taking advantage of the scenery beyond the garden. So always there is this idea of the near, what's close by, what is in the middle, and what is far, and everything is sort of included in design. And the idea of things changing, of course, is very central to Buddhist and Japanese ideas. So, yes, it's understood that things will change, but the essence and the memory of the design continues for a very long time. I want to actually say something like in Meiji period, when there was such a movement to reject all Japanese design and Japanese ideas and say, oh, no, no, these are too backward, we want to westernize. So there was almost like this idea of uncompromised westernization that the government, Meiji government, was pushing, that people going to government events had to dress in Western clothes, and all the army, everybody now had Western clothes. So at that time, actually, they destroyed some of the beautiful Japanese gardens and instead made Western style parks. So that was like a strange period in Japanese history. But some of them actually then got reverted back to their original design, but some didn't.
And I think a lot of people who are coming from the sort of Western style of gardening may, if they're very, very lucky, have a kind of once in a lifetime trip to Japan. But, and I'm going to ask you an impossible question now, because I know it's a vast place and there is so much to see. But bearing in mind that a lot of people may only make it there once, if at all, would you say that there's a particular region or a particular garden even that you would say, if you can see one or you can see some, these are the ones to pick?
Yeah, I would say if you can only go to one place and see gardens, then go to Kyoto. Because in Kyoto, you will be able to see temple gardens, you will be able to see public gardens, and the whole city actually has that mood, shall I say, of a Japanese garden. So they are cherry blossom lined trees. Yes, if you can, go in the cherry blossom season, which is a bit of a gamble because they tell you the date when it's going to bloom in a certain year, but sometimes that date changes depending on weather. But there are several types of cherry trees, so you'll still catch some. So if you can only go to one place, then I would say go to Kyoto. In Kyoto, you will be able to see the Ryoanji, which is like the world famous rock garden. You will be able to enjoy many different kinds of gardens. But I also want to tell people, for example, there are Japanese gardens in so many places. In Holland Park in London, there's a beautiful, beautiful Japanese garden. So if you love Japanese gardens, start going to these and then go to Kyoto. There are beautiful gardens also in Hiroshima. In Tokyo, Tokyo has the East Garden of the Imperial Palace, which is absolutely spectacular. There is Hapoen. So, yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit about the symbolism of the stones that are used in the gardens?
Yes. So stones are so special in Japan because they symbolize eternity, the idea of time. You appreciate impermanence, but you also want to understand eternity. So that's where rocks come in. And rocks in Japanese gardens could symbolize, for example, in Chinese gardens, a tall rock next to a low rock could be like a turtle and a bird of eternity. But on the other hand, rocks could be simply aesthetic. So in Ryoanji Garden, which is amongst the most famous rock gardens in the world, so they are these rocks, and everyone is trying to guess, but do they mean island? Because the small pebbles around that have been raked in the shape of waves. So people are always wondering. But the time that this was designed, it was also a bold and abstract design. So they don't always have to have that symbolic meaning that you would look for in a Chinese garden. This could simply be aesthetic. But the other thing is that only 1/3 of the rock should be seen above the surface. 2/3 should be underground because that's how rocks are. And so the Japanese gardeners go to great lengths, first of all, to find these amazing rocks, and then to bring them is quite a big undertaking. And then to have most of it underground, it's a Japanese principle, you may say. I actually did a design of AIG building in central Tokyo, not far from the Imperial Palace. And we wanted to bring stones, and the whole road had to be closed, and a big crane had to be brought in to bring these big stones into the lobby and at the entrance. So to think that these huge rocks have been moved in these gardens at the time that there were no cranes, it's quite, something to appreciate. Also, in gardens, you might have a dry stream. So, a dry stream is one of the typical elements of the garden where they want you to imagine water, but there is actually no water. So, there would be rocks laid out in a manner like as if a stream in rainy season is going to flow over it. And you have to imagine that the rest of the year. Yeah, so rocks and water, right? So there's greenery, there's rocks, there's water, and then there's very few bits of color every now and then. So those are the essential elements of Japanese gardens.
And why is there the lack of colour? Has anybody kind of put a theory forward about that?
So there's avoidance of gaudiness. That's part of Japanese design. So as not to be gaudy, but to be serene and minimalistic. So I think that's where this control of color comes on. Like if you went to the moss garden in Kyoto, so there's thick, thick moss everywhere. So that makes the whole place very, very quiet. And it's all different shades of greens. You don't see colors. That's on purpose, that's by design. So minimalism is a very important element.
So in a lot of the Japanese gardens, you don't see a kind of traditional symmetrical layout to the design. And I'm assuming that is also intentional.
Yes, actually, symmetry is considered a dead end in design. So they avoid it at every cost. And you're very, very intentional about avoiding symmetry, whether it is in architecture, whether it is in painting. If you see Japanese woodblock prints or painting, you definitely will not see symmetrical because that's like a very Western idea and not dynamic enough. So there's usually a huge diagonal in Japanese paintings, which then makes it impossible to make a symmetrical design. So the Western gardens are really all laid out symmetrically, but Japanese gardens avoid that because the idea is that we are mimicking and appreciating and emulating nature. And nature is not geometrically symmetrical. So you don't want to do that. I learned Ikebana flower arrangement for a long time. So that's all about never, never, never do symmetrical design. And I would do something and the teacher would come and just turn it one little bit and it would magically, look so amazing. So that's the kind of sharp, what can I say, razor edge kind of aesthetic of not being symmetrical, but dynamic and yet balanced, right? So that's the aspiration. And you see that all the time in Japanese gardens. You would really not see a symmetrical composition when either in the viewing gardens or in the stroll gardens. You would always have this sense of balance, but it's not symmetrical.
Thank you very much to Geeta for her insight and for this beautiful book. And thanks to you, of course, for listening. If you like this episode, I recommend checking out 271 Japanese Maples with Miles Hayward and 118 Takashi Millennium Forest with Dan Pearson and Midori Shintani. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.